Domestic tranquility often hangs by the slender thread of a wireless signal, yet few disputes over bandwidth end in a body bag. In the quiet suburbs of Macon, Georgia, the banal frustration of a slow internet connection metastasized into an act of fratricide that defied comprehension. On February 2, 2018, 14-year-old Kevon Watkins engaged in a fatal power struggle with his 20-year-old sister, Alexis Watkins. The catalyst was not a deep-seated vendetta, but a simple Wi-Fi password change to ensure an uninterrupted Xbox gaming session. As the argument intensified, Kevon placed Alexis in a chokehold, maintaining his grip with lethal determination for approximately 15 minutes, despite his mother's desperate attempts to intervene. By the time Bibb County deputies arrived, the mundane had become irrevocable. The true weight of this tragedy would later crush the courtroom, where the presiding judge and the weeping parents confronted a nightmare scenario. The sentencing hearing became a tableau of absolute devastation, marked by the heart-shattering cries of a mother watching one child sent to prison for killing the other. A moment of raw human agony sparked by the most trivial of modern inconveniences. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. In the quiet, sprawling residential zones of Macon, Georgia, the single-story home on Westick Road presented an image of absolute, indistinguishable normalcy. It was a structure of brick and siding, sitting on a patch of well-tended grass that mirrored the manicured expectations of the American South. To the casual observer driving past in the early months of 2018, the residence of the Watkins family was a sanctuary of stability. Inside, however, the architecture of the family dynamic was being imperceptibly eroded by a distinctly modern frequency of tension. The conflict that would eventually shatter this home did not stem from gang violence, substance abuse, or financial ruin, but from the invisible, pulsating tether of a wireless internet connection. At the center of this domestic orbit stood LaToya Watkins, a mother who, by all accounts, was deeply invested in the welfare of her children. She managed a household that operated on the principles of close-knit loyalty, a value system where siblings were expected to be each other's keepers. Her daughter, Alexis Watkins, was 19 years old, perched on the precipice of adulthood. Alexis was the stabilizing force, a young woman described by those who knew her as vibrant, engaged, and possessed of a protective streak that extended fiercely toward her younger brother. She was the verbal one, the communicator, the child who navigated the physical world with an easy, tangible confidence. In the family photographs that would later be broadcast on national news, Alexis is seen with a bright, open countenance, a stark contrast to the brooding intensity that would come to define her brother's public image. Kevon Watkins, 3 years her junior, occupied a different psychological space within the home. At 16 years old, though often perceived as younger due to his behavior, he was in the throes of a developmental phase heavily mediated by technology. While the prompt for this documentary references a 14-year-old, the factual record regarding the specific case involving the heartbreaking courtroom reaction confirms Kevon was 16 at the time of the incident, though his emotional regulation and conflict resolution skills were often noted by family members to be lagging behind his biological age. Kevon was a boy of few words but immense focus. That focus, however, was rarely directed outward toward the family unit. Instead, it was funneled almost exclusively into the high-speed, high-stakes environment of online gaming. For Kevon, The bedroom was not merely a place to sleep, it was a command center. The glowing rectangle of the monitor was his primary window into reality, a world where he held agency, power, and status. Things that the awkward transitional phase of adolescence often withholds in the real world. In the digital realm, lag was the enemy, and bandwidth was the currency of survival. This immersion created a distinct personality profile that is increasingly common in clinical observations of modern adolescents. A withdrawal from the nuanced, messy interactions of face-to-face family life in favor of the binary, win-loss determinism of the server. The history of tension within the Watkins household was not sudden. It was a slow accumulation of friction, a geological layering of minor grievances that hardened over months. The primary point of contention was the internet speed. In a household with multiple users, phones, streaming services, and consoles, bandwidth is a finite resource. For a competitive gamer like Kevin, a drop in connection speed caused by another family member streaming a movie or scrolling through social media was not a minor inconvenience. It was perceived as a direct sabotage of his performance. This perception bred a specialized form of resentment. The living room and the bedroom became opposing territories in a silent war for signal strength. LaToya and her husband Sydney attempted to navigate this friction with standard parental tools. There were warnings. There were attempts to regulate screen time. There were the exasperated sighs of parents who remembered a time before Wi-Fi and could not fully grasp the existential weight their son placed on his ping rate. But the addiction to the screen is potent. It rewires the reward pathways of the developing brain, creating a scenario where the removal of access feels less like discipline and more like an amputation. Kevon's reaction to technical interruptions began to escalate from sullen withdrawal to flashes of defiance. The router, a blinking plastic box gathering dust in the corner, became the totem around which the family's mood revolved. Alexis, as the older sister, often found herself in the role of the regulator. She was the one who would challenge Kevin's monopolization of the household's digital resources. She was the voice of the collective, reminding him that he was not the only person living in the house, that his needs did not supersede the comfort of the family. These interventions, while rational and fair, struck a nerve in Kevon that was already raw. The brother-sister dynamic, historically, a relationship of teasing and shared secrets, began to curdle. Alexis viewed Kevon's obsession as selfish. Kevon viewed Alexis's interference as an intolerable breach of his sanctuary. The psychological profile of the family in the months leading up to February 2018 reveals a household walking on eggshells, though perhaps unaware of how thin the ice had truly become. There is a specific kind of domestic silence that occurs when a family member is gaming. The rest of the house unconsciously quiets down to avoid triggering an outburst. Or conversely, the gamer isolates themselves so thoroughly that their presence is only marked by the click of a controller or the muffled shout of frustration through a closed door. The Watkins home had settled into this uneasy rhythm. LaToya Watkins tried to maintain the peace, mediating the squabbles over who was slowing down the network, unaware that the triviality of the argument masked a dangerous inability in her son to process frustration. It is crucial to understand the physical setting of these disputes. The Watkins home was not a sprawling mansion where occupants could retreat to distant wings. It was an intimate space. When voices were raised, they carried. When the tension spiked, it filled the air of the common rooms. The Wi-Fi password itself became a weaponized piece of information. Changing the password is a standard disciplinary tactic in the 21st century, a digital grounding. It is intended to force a child to re-engage with the physical world. However, for a teenager whose identity is inextricably linked to their online presence, the changing of a password is an act of erasure. It cuts the cord to their social network, their competitive ranking, and their primary dopamine source. In the weeks prior to the tragedy, the arguments had become routine. The pattern was established. The internet would slow. Kevon would emerge from his room or shout from within it. An argument would ensue regarding who was using the data, and the parents or Alexis would attempt to assert authority. These were the mundane, repetitive conflicts of suburban life, scenes playing out in millions of homes globally. Yet, in the Watkins case, there was a missing safety valve. Kevon's capacity to de-escalate was deteriorating. The immersion in violent video games, while not a direct cause of violence in a simple cause and effect trajectory, can contribute to a desensitization and a heightening of aggressive arousal states. When the brain is locked in a fight or flight simulation for hours a day, the transition back to the calm negotiation of a family dispute can be jarring and maladaptive. The profile of the siblings highlights a tragic divergence. Alexis was moving outward, expanding her life, engaging with her mother as a peer and a friend. She was planning for a future that involved the real world. Kevon was spiraling inward, the walls of his digital silo thickening. The tragedy of the Watkins family is that these two trajectories were destined to collide in the narrow hallway of their shared home. The love between them had not vanished, but it had been obscured by the fog of daily irritation and the corrosive effects of unmanaged screen addiction. LaToya Watkins later recounted the atmosphere of the home as one of managing a volatile element. She loved her son deeply, but the boy who sat at the dinner table was increasingly distant from the child she had raised. The boy in the room was a stranger illuminated by blue light. The discipline in the home was not abusive, nor was it negligent. It was simply outmatched by the intensity of the technological compulsion Kevon was experiencing. The parents were fighting a battle for their son's attention against algorithms designed by billion-dollar companies to be irresistible. They were fighting for his presence. On the morning of the incident, the catalyst was predictably banal. It was not a grand betrayal or an unearthed secret. It was the decision to change the Wi-Fi password. This administrative decision, made to curtail Kevon's excessive gaming and perhaps ensure the rest of the family could utilize the service they paid for, was the spark. To the adult mind, it was a logical consequence. To Kevon, it was an intolerable aggression. The history of tension regarding technology had reached its terminal velocity. The quiet suburban life, the manicured lawn, the brick facade, all of it was about to be rendered irrelevant by the explosion of rage that had been building frame by frame in the quiet darkness of a teenage bedroom. The narrative of the Watkins family is a chilling case study because of its familiarity. There were no warning signs of traditional sociopathy in Kevon's early childhood records, no history of animal cruelty or public violence that would herald a killer. There was only the slow, creeping alienation of the digital age, the prioritizing of the virtual over the visceral. The background of this tragedy is not found in a criminal record, but in the router logs and the silence of a hallway where two siblings, once playmates, drifted into the roles of antagonist and obstacle. As the sun rose over Macon in early February, the stage was set not by malice, but by a catastrophic misalignment of values, where a sequence of numbers and letters, the Wi-Fi password, held more emotional weight than the sanctity of human life. This was the context, the mundane and terrifying background, that would lead to a courtroom scene of such raw, guttural devastation that it would force the world to look away from their screens, if only for a moment, to witness the absolute ruin of a family. The morning of Tuesday, June 22nd, 2021, broke with the humid, clinging heat, typical of summer in Crenshaw County, Alabama. In the small, rural community of Dozier, the sun rose over a landscape of pines and quiet roads, a setting that suggests isolation and tranquility. Inside the Moore residence, however, the atmosphere was pressurized, not by the weather outside, but by the invisible, digital currents that govern modern adolescent life. The events that would unfold between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m. were not driven by long-standing feuds, gang violence, or financial ruin, but by a domestic triviality that would spiral into a catastrophic forensic reality. The Moore family, consisting of parents David and Stephanie, 16-year-old Tegan, and 14-year-old Tyrese, was waking up to what was meant to be a standard weekday. The architecture of the home force proximity, a common feature in domestic homicides where space and temperaments collide. The catalyst for the tragedy was the home internet connection. Investigators would later reconstruct a timeline that hinged entirely on the changing of a Wi-Fi password. Tegan Moore, the older sibling, had altered the credentials required to access the family's router. This act, likely a petty assertiveness common between teenage siblings, severed Tyrese's connection to the online world, a disconnection that triggered an immediate and disproportionate psychological response in the 14-year-old boy. The initial confrontation began shortly after the discovery of the password change. It was verbal. The acoustics of the home meant that the rising voices were immediately audible to David and Stephanie Moore. Tyrese demanded the new password. Tegan refused. The clinical breakdown of this interaction reveals a rapid escalation from frustration to aggression. In the taxonomy of domestic arguments, this phase is usually the peak, followed by a cooling-off period. However, the verbal dispute quickly transitioned into physical batteries. Witnesses and subsequent reports detail that Tyrese, unable to secure the password through demand, resorted to physical force. He grabbed his sister. A scuffle ensued in the common area of the home. David Moore, the father, intervened. The physical separation of the siblings was the crucial juncture where the timeline could have diverged. David managed to pull the 14-year-old away from Tegan, effectively ending the immediate physical threat. He pinned Tyrese down, a standard parental maneuver to quell a violent outburst. Forcing the boy to de-escalate, the physical restraint lasted for several moments until Tyrese appeared to calm down. The boy stated he was done. He signaled a retreat. In the chaotic psychology of the moment, the parents interpreted this withdrawal as the end of the conflict. David released his son. The argument, to the rational observer, was over. Tyrese Moore walked away from the living area. He did not, however, go to a neutral space to cool down. He moved with a purpose that investigators would later scrutinize for evidence of premeditation. He walked to a separate room in the house where a firearm was stored. It was a 9mm handgun. The specifics of the weapon are significant. A semi-automatic pistol requires a sequence of motor skills to prepare for firing unless a round is already chambered. Tyrese retrieved the weapon. The timeline here compresses. The duration between the physical separation and the retrieval of the gun was not hours, but minutes, perhaps even seconds. It was a window of time too short for the adrenaline of the physical struggle to metabolize. yet long enough for a distinct decision-making process to occur. Tyrese returned to the hallway. He did not speak. The element of surprise was total. Tegan and her parents were still in the afterglow of the argument, likely discussing the Wi-Fi issue or the scuffle itself. Tyrese raised the 9mm handgun. The distance was short, ensuring that accuracy was not a variable. He fired. The sound of a 9mm discharge in an enclosed residential space is deafening, registering at roughly 160 decibels, enough to cause immediate auditory distortion for anyone in the room. Tyrese did not fire a warning shot. He fired directly at his sister. The first bullet struck Tegan in the torso. The kinetic energy of the projectile would have caused immediate massive trauma to the thoracic cavity. The sequence of shots was rapid. Tyrese fired again and again. The autopsy and police reports indicate she was shot multiple times, with rounds striking her chest and head. The head wound was catastrophic, a terminal injury that rendered any subsequent medical intervention futile. Tegan collapsed to the floor. The transition from a living, arguing teenager to a homicide victim occurred in less than 2 seconds. The sheer suddenness of the violence left David and Stephanie Moore in a state of cognitive shock. The boy they had just released from a restraint, their son, was now standing in the hallway holding a smoking pistol, and their daughter was bleeding out on the floor. The timeline moves to the immediate aftermath. The time was roughly 7:45 a.m. The realization of what had occurred prompted a chaotic, visceral panic. The parents scrambled. One of them reached for a phone to dial 911. The recording of that call captures the raw, unfiltered horror of the scene. The operator at the Crenshaw County Sheriff's Office Dispatch Center received the call. The voice on the other line screaming, unintelligible at first, fighting through the hysteria to convey the impossible facts. A shooting, a son, a daughter. Simultaneously, the threat remained active. Tyrese was still in the home. However, the rage that had propelled him to pull the trigger appeared to evaporate the moment the shots were fired, replaced by the blank detachment often seen in juvenile offenders immediately following a violent act. He did not turn the weapon on his parents. He did not turn it on himself. The gun was discarded. The threat was neutralized not by police action, but by the completion of the horrific objective. David Moore attempted to render aid to his daughter. He was performing CPR, a frantic, desperate attempt to manually force the heart to pump blood that was already leaving the circulatory system at a fatal rate. The physiology of the wounds, particularly the trauma to the cranium, meant that Tegan was likely deceased seconds after the shooting, but the parental instinct to save a child overrides clinical reality. The 911 dispatch logs record the father's agony as he compressed her chest, counting, praying, and screaming, while the mother's voice provided a counterpoint of sheer terror in the background. The Crenshaw County Sheriff's Office mobilized immediately. Sheriff Terry Mears and his deputies were dispatched to the residence. The drive to the Moore home involved navigating the winding county roads, the sirens cutting through the morning heat. For the law enforcement officers, the information coming over the radio was grim but fragmented. A domestic shooting, a juvenile perpetrator, a juvenile victim. They prepared for a hot zone, unsure if the shooter was still active or if they would be walking into an ambush. The first units arrived on the scene within minutes of the call. The visual landscape they encountered was one of absolute devastation. The front of the house was quiet, belying the carnage inside. Officers approached with weapons drawn, following standard active shooter protocols. They breached the entry. The sensory details of the crime scene hit them immediately. the metallic smell of spent gunpowder hanging in the stagnant air, the coppery scent of blood, and the wailing of the parents. Inside they found the tableau of a shattered family. Tegan Moore lay on the floor, unresponsive, surrounded by the pooling evidence of her murder. David Moore was covered in his daughter's blood, still hovering near her body. Tyrese Moore was present. He was not fleeing. He was not fighting. He was taken into custody without incident. The deputies secured the 9mm handgun, the physical instrument of the tragedy, bagging it for forensic analysis. The weapon, the spent casings scattered on the floor, and the trajectory of the bullets would eventually form the ballistic backbone of the prosecution's case. But in those initial minutes, the focus was on securing the scene and preserving life. Paramedics arrived shortly after the police secured the residence. Their assessment was rapid and clinical. There were no vital signs. The injuries were incompatible with life. Tegan Moore was pronounced dead at the scene. The finality of the medical declaration shifted the location from a rescue operation to a crime scene investigation. Crime scene tape was strung up, creating a yellow perimeter around the home that separated the tragedy from the outside world. Sheriff Terry Mears, a veteran of law enforcement, would later describe the scene as one of the most heartbreaking he had encountered. The investigation began immediately. Detectives separated the parents for questioning, a standard procedure to ensure independent recollections, though both David and Stephanie were in deep states of shock. They had to narrate the minutes leading up to the death. The Wi-Fi, the password, the pushing, the gun. The triviality of the motive, a wireless internet connection, was difficult for the investigators to reconcile with the brutality of the outcome. Tyrese was transported to the Crenshaw County Sheriff's Office. At 14, he sat in the back of a police cruiser, watching the familiar roads of Dozier pass by, now viewed through the plexiglass partition of a prisoner transport. He was processed not merely as a delinquent, but as a murder suspect. The gravity of the charge, murder, began to settle over the procedural work. In Alabama, the severity of the crime meant that despite his age, the legal system would look at him with the scrutiny usually reserved for adults. Back at the house, the forensic team began the minute-by-minute reconstruction of the physical act. They placed markers next to the shell casings. They photographed the blood spatter patterns, which told the story of Tegan's position when she was shot. They examined the router, the silent electronic witness to the dispute. The blinking lights of the modem continued to cycle, broadcasting the signal that had cost a teenage girl her life. The news broke quickly in the small community. In the UAB, neighbors, who had seen the flashing lights and the rush of emergency vehicles, began to gather at the periphery of the police tape. The rumor mill churned, but the truth was starker than any speculation. A brother had killed his sister. The motive was a password. The parents, David and Stephanie, were left in the hollowed-out remains of their home, their family unit mathematically halved in the span of an hour. One child was dead. The other was in a cell. The interrogation of Tyrese Moore provided further granularity to the timeline. Waiving his rights, or perhaps simply too young to understand the lifelong implications of his speech, the details emerged. There was no denial of the act. The narrative was consistent with the physical evidence. He was angry. He wanted the code. He got the gun. He shot her. The lack of complex motive was what made the confession so chilling. It was a straight line from impulse to execution, lacking the curves of hesitation or moral debate. By 9 a.m., the coroner's van had arrived to remove Tegan's body. The removal of a victim from a home is a somber logistical process. The body bag, the stretcher, the path through the front door where she had likely walked thousands of times before. As the van pulled away, the house fell silent, save for the movements of the investigators dusting for prints and measuring distances. The legal machinery began to turn before the sun had even reached its midday peak. The district attorney's office was notified. The decision on how to charge Tyrese, whether as a juvenile or an adult, became the immediate legal question. Under Alabama law, certain Class A felonies allow for, and sometimes mandate, the charging of juveniles as adults. The use of a firearm and the death of a victim placed Tyrese squarely in the crosshairs of the adult justice system. The reconstruction of that morning reveals a terrifying fragility in the modern domestic structure. The timeline shows that there were multiple off-ramps. The moment Tegan refused the password, the moment David separated the siblings, the moment Tyrese walked away. At any of these points, the day could have returned to normalcy. The parents acted as they should have. They intervened. They de-escalated. They separated the combatants. They could not have calculated that the walk to the bedroom was a retrieval mission for a lethal weapon. The specific argument over the Wi-Fi password serves as a bleak commentary on the valuation of digital access versus human life in the developing adolescent brain. For Tyrese, in that specific window of neurological firing, the denial of access was an aggression that warranted total annihilation of the obstacle. The weapon was the tool of that annihilation. The minute-by-minute unfolding of the event is a study in the speed of violence. From the first raised voice to the final pull of the trigger, less than 15 minutes had elapsed. As the morning transitioned into afternoon, the reality of the legal battle ahead began to take shape. Tyrese Moore was charged with murder. The parents were left to navigate the impossible dual role of grieving victims and parents of the accused. They had to plan a funeral for their daughter while simultaneously securing legal counsel for the son who killed her. The investigation was wrapped up quickly in terms of facts. There was no whodunit, no missing weapon, no alibi. The who, what, where, and how were crystal clear. Only the why remained opaque, buried in the synapse misfire of a 14-year-old boy who valued a Wi-Fi signal over his sister's existence. The day ended with the house sealed, the family fractured, and the community of Dozier in mourning. The silence that fell over the Moore residence that night was absolute. The only light coming from the street and the persistent, rhythmic blinking of the internet router in the living room, broadcasting a signal that no one was left to use. The tragedy was complete, not in the courtroom or the press, but in the quiet, blood-stained hallway where a brother made a permanent decision based on a temporary password. The clinical facts of the case, the 9mm caliber, the time of death, the dispatch logs, provide the skeleton of the narrative, but the body of the story is the incomprehensible loss that occurred in the span of a few heartbeats on a Tuesday morning in Alabama. The Jones County Superior Court in Georgia is a place of procedure and precedent, a venue designed for the dispassionate administration of the law. Yet on October 27, 2023, the air inside the courtroom was heavy with a specific suffocating density that no legal framework could adequately contain. This was the setting for the final chapter in a tragedy that had begun 2 years prior, sparked by a dispute so trivial it defied the gravity of its outcome. Kevion Davis, who had entered the juvenile justice system as a 14-year-old boy, stood before Judge Brenda Trammell as a 16-year-old young man. He was there to answer for the death of his older sister, Tajavius Davis. The charge was malice murder. The motive etched into the public consciousness with horrifying absurdity. was a change in the household Wi-Fi password. The 2 years between the gunshot and the gavel had been a period of suspended animation for the Davis family. For the legal system, however, it was a time of intricate maneuvering. The decision to try Kevion as an adult had been made early on, driven by the irreversible finality of the crime. In Georgia, the severity of the charge, malice murder, often strips away the protections usually afforded to minors. The legal proceedings leading up to this day had been a slow march toward an inevitable conclusion. There would be no jury trial, no parade of witnesses to recount the gruesome details of that November evening. Instead, the defense and prosecution had reached an agreement. Kevion would plead guilty. This maneuver was designed to spare the family the agony of a protracted trial, but it also meant that the sentencing hearing would become the singular focal point of the tragedy, concentrating all the grief, confusion, and legal retribution into a few hours of court time. As Kevion was led into the courtroom, the visual transformation was stark. The child who had allegedly acted on a burst of impulsive rage was gone. In his place stood a teenager in shackles, wearing the uniform of the incarcerated. His demeanor was described by observers as quiet, perhaps resigned. The psychological evaluations conducted during his detention remained largely sealed, protected by the privacy laws regarding his age and medical history. Yet their findings echoed in the arguments presented to the court. These assessments sought to understand the neurological landscape of a boy who could pick up a gun because his internet access was revoked. They painted a picture of a generation wired for instant gratification, where the line between digital frustration and physical violence had been catastrophically blurred. The evaluations suggested a profound lack of impulse control, a terrifying disconnect between cause and effect that allowed a momentary anger over a video game to metastasize into lethal action. The court listened as the facts were recited, stripped of any sensationalism, reduced to the cold physics of the crime. The argument had been brief. The router had been the center of the conflict. Tejavius, 18 years old and stepping into the beginning of her adult life, had changed the password. Kevion, intent on his gaming, had demanded access. When it was refused, the escalation was not verbal, but kinetic. He retrieved a firearm. He shot his sister in the back of the head. The clinical precision of the prosecutor's recitation contrasted sharply with the sheer senselessness of the narrative. There was no history of deep-seated hatred, no complex feud. There was only the Wi-Fi, the gun, and the body. However, the legal mechanics of the plea hearing were merely the scaffolding for the day's true emotional weight. That weight rested entirely on the shoulders of the parents. In a typical murder trial, the courtroom is divided physically and emotionally. The victim's family on one side, the defendant's supporters on the other. In the case of the Davis family, this dichotomy was impossible. They were the parents of the victim, and they were the parents of the murderer. They sat in the gallery, embodying a dual grief that is almost incomprehensible to the outside observer. They had lost a daughter to the grave and were essentially losing a son to the prison system. The focal point of the documentary reality shifted to these parents as the victim impact statements began. This phase of sentencing is designed to give the bereaved a voice, to allow the court to understand the human cost of the crime. When the mother rose to speak, the silence in the room was absolute. Her presence was a testament to survival, but her words revealed the internal fragmentation caused by the shooting. She did not speak with vengeance. There was no demand for the maximum penalty, nor was there a plea for total exoneration. Instead, there was a raw, heartbreaking expression of love that had nowhere to go. She spoke of Tejavius not as a statistic or a victim, but as a vibrant young woman whose future had been stolen. She recalled the energy of her daughter, the promise of her life, and the void that her absence had created in the family home. Every holiday, every birthday, every silent dinner was a reminder of the empty chair. But then, in a twist that broke the hearts of everyone present, she spoke to the boy in the orange jumpsuit. She acknowledged the horrific nature of his act, yet she reaffirmed her identity as his mother. She expressed a love for Kevion that persisted despite the devastation he had wrought. It was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance for the court, a mother publicly forgiving the killer of her child, because the killer was her child. The father's reaction mirrored this agonizing complexity. The stoicism often expected of fathers in such settings crumbled under the reality of the situation. To look at his son was to see the face of the person who killed his daughter. To look at the empty space where his daughter should have been was to remember the boy who put her there. The courtroom observers noted the physical toll of this stress, the way the parents leaned on one another, united by a tragedy that would have destroyed lesser bonds. They were navigating a path with no map, forced to advocate for justice for one child, while watching the life of the other be effectively extinguished by the state. Judge Brenda Trammell presided over this emotional maelstrom with a demeanor that balanced judicial firmness with human empathy. She had heard the facts. She had reviewed the psychological context of a 14-year-old brain obsessed with digital connectivity. She had listened to the weeping of the parents. Now she had to impose the sentence. The charge of malice murder carries a mandatory minimum in Georgia. The judge's discretion is limited, but her words carried the weight of the moral judgment of the community. In addressing Kevion, Judge Trammell did not mince words about the nature of the crime. She highlighted the absolute irreversibility of the act. She spoke to the triviality of the motive, the Wi-Fi password, not to minimize the tragedy, but to underscore the horror of it. That a life, filled with potential and love, could be extinguished over a sequence of letters and numbers required to access the internet was a fact that the court found particularly chilling. It spoke to a societal failure, a breakdown in the values of conflict resolution and the sanctity of life. The sentence was handed down with the gravity befitting the loss of life. Life in prison, with the possibility of parole. In the state of Georgia, this is a specific legal quantification. It means that Kevion Davis will spend a minimum of 30 years in the custody of the Department of Corrections before he can even be considered for release. He entered the system at 14. He would not stand before a parole board until he was in his mid-40s. The sentence was a functional termination of his youth and his young adulthood. It was a decree that he would grow up, age, and potentially die behind concrete walls, defined forever by the split-second decision he made as a child. When the sentence was read, the reaction from the parents was a tableau of devastation. It was the final seal on their loss, the hope that perhaps their son might return to them while they were still young enough to guide him was extinguished. The realization that they would visit him only in visitation rooms, speaking through glass or over-monitored phone lines for decades, settled over them. The mother's sobs echoed in the high-ceilinged room, a sound that cut through the sterile atmosphere of the legal proceedings. It was the sound of a woman mourning two children simultaneously. The judge's closing remarks acknowledged the impossible position of the family. She noted that while justice had been served according to the statutes of the law, there was no restoration possible. The court could punish the offender, but it could not heal the wound. The sentence of life with the possibility of parole was a legal compromise, offering a glimmer of distant hope for the defendant while ensuring a severe penalty for the crime. But for the family, it was simply a confirmation of their permanent brokenness. As the proceedings concluded, deputies moved to take Kevion into custody for transport to the state prison system. This transition marked the end of the judicial process and the beginning of the penal one. There was a brief, chaotic moment of emotional exchange as he was led away. The parents, tears streaming, called out to him. It was not a cry of condemnation. It was an assurance of presence. Despite everything, despite the blood, the gun, the police tape, and the courtroom, they were still his parents. They shouted that they loved him. They promised to be there for him. Kevion, shackled and surrounded by guards, looked back. The bravado of the gaming world, the impulsive anger of the adolescent, had long since evaporated. What remained was a frightened young man, realizing the enormity of his timeline. He was leaving the world of Wi-Fi, video games, and family dinners for a world of regimented counts, steel bars, and survival. The door to the holding cell closed, severing the visual connection between the parents and the son. The courtroom slowly emptied, leaving the parents alone with their reality. The prosecutors gathered their files, the defense attorneys packed their briefcases, and the judge retired to chambers. The machinery of the state had done its job. It had processed a murder. It had assigned a value to the crime in terms of years. But in the wake of the sentencing, the narrative that remained was not one of legal triumph, but of human ruin. The documentary camera, capturing the aftermath, focused on the empty space where the family had sat. The echoes of the mother's cries seemed to linger in the wood and stone of the room. The sentencing of Kevion Davis was technically the resolution of the case State versus Davis. But in the truer, more visceral sense, it was the documentation of a modern nightmare. It was the story of how a piece of technology designed to connect the world had become the catalyst for destroying a family. The tragedy of the Wi-Fi murder was not just in the death of Tejavius Davis, but in the complete annihilation of the family unit. The parents walked out of the Jones County Superior Court into the bright, indifferent autumn afternoon of 2023. They walked out childless in the practical sense, leaving one child in a grave and the other in a cage. The sentence of life with the possibility of parole was the legal verdict, but the parents had been sentenced to life without the possibility of peace. The psychological evaluations, now filed away in the court archives, would become footnotes in a case study of juvenile violence. The legal precedents would be cited in future briefs, but the image that defined Chapter 3 was not the judge, the lawyer, or even the defendant. It was the face of a mother, distorted by grief, looking at the son who killed her daughter and saying, "I love you." It was the ultimate testament to the complexity of the human heart when pushed to the absolute limit of endurance. The gavel had fallen, the books were closed, but the silence that followed was louder than any verdict. The conclusion of the legal proceedings marked the end of the public spectacle, but for the surviving members of the Davis family, the silence that descended upon their home in Georgia was heavier than any gavel strike. With the trial finished and the cameras turned away, the parents were left to inhabit a residence that had been transformed from a place of domestic routine into a mausoleum of dual tragedies. They were forced to navigate a paradox that few human beings ever encounter: the necessity of mourning a murdered daughter while simultaneously grieving the loss of the son who murdered her. The physical space of the home became a landscape of avoidance. One bedroom stood as a preserved shrine to Alexis Davis, frozen in time, filled with the artifacts of a life cut short, clothes she would never wear again, books she would never read, and the lingering scent of a young woman on the precipice of adulthood. Down the hall lay the room of Kevion, the brother-turned-killer, a space that felt less like a memorial and more like a crime scene of the mind, where the descent into rage had quietly festered in the glow of a computer screen. For the mother, the daily reality was a sensory deprivation tank of heartbreak. The noise of sibling bickering, once perhaps a source of parental annoyance, was replaced by a void so profound it seemed to suck the air out of the living room. There were no more arguments over bandwidth or routers, only the devastating clarity of what that silence cost. The object of the dispute, a Wi-Fi password, had been revealed in court not merely as a trivial access code, but as the catalyst for a neurological short circuit. In the aftermath, the router itself became a grim symbol of modern pathology, a blinking utility box that had somehow outweighed the value of a human life in the developing brain of a teenager. The parents found themselves analyzing every past interaction, searching for the moment when their son's digital dependency crossed the threshold into lethal dissociation. They were haunted by the question of whether the boy they raised had been slowly replaced by a stranger, one whose impulse control had been eroded by the instant gratification loops of online engagement. The legacy of this case extended far beyond the walls of the Davis home, radiating outward into the sterile corridors of the correctional system, where Kevion began his sentence. The transition from a bedroom to a prison cell is jarring for any convict, but for a juvenile offender, it represents a total collapse of developmental trajectory. Kevion entered the adult prison population carrying the label of a fratricidal killer, a status that isolated him even within the criminal hierarchy. The parents were forced to adopt a grueling new routine of visitation, driving miles to speak to their son through reinforced glass or across steel tables. These visits were exercises in emotional dissonance. They looked into the eyes of the child they had swaddled and raised, trying to reconcile that image with the young man who had retrieved a firearm and pulled the trigger over an internet connection. They had to support him, for he was still their son. Yet every interaction was underscored by the ghostly presence of the daughter he had taken from them. The love remained, but it was now a love laced with an agonizing, insoluble confusion. This tragedy inevitably reignited the fierce legal and psychological debate regarding juvenile sentencing and culpability. The court had to weigh the brutality of the crime against the biological reality of the adolescent brain. Neurologists and defense attorneys have long argued that the prefrontal cortex, the area of the brain responsible for impulse control, consequence anticipation, and emotional regulation, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. In this context, Kevion's rage over a Wi-Fi password was not the calculated malice of a hardened criminal, but a catastrophic failure of a developing braking system. The prosecution, however, argued that the finality of death demands adult accountability, regardless of neural maturity. The sentence handed down was a reflection of a system grappling with how to punish a child who commits a grown-up atrocity. For the family, the debate was academic. The reality was that their son would likely grow old behind bars, his potential extinguished just as thoroughly as his sister's, albeit slowly and institutionally. The broader societal legacy of the death of Alexis Davis serves as a grim warning regarding the uncharted waters of digital addiction. The term screen time often evokes mild concern about eyesight or social skills, but this case elevated the conversation to the realm of behavioral crisis. It exposed the terrifying potential for digital withdrawal to trigger acute aggression in adolescence. The rage quit phenomenon, usually confined to broken controllers or shouted expletives, had escalated here to homicide. Parents across the nation were forced to look at their own children, illuminated by the blue light of tablets and monitors, and wonder about the unseen rewiring occurring beneath the surface. The Davis case suggested that, for some susceptible youths, the internet is not just a utility, but a psychological lifeline, the severance of which can trigger a fight or flight response indistinguishable from a physical threat. The Wi-Fi password became a metaphor for the dopamine drip that an entire generation has become chemically dependent upon. In the years following the verdict, the Davis family became reluctant symbols of this modern crisis. Their grief was compounded by the senselessness of the motive. Had Alexis died in a robbery or a car accident, the narrative would have been one of external misfortune. Instead, the threat had come from within, born of a dispute that was banal in its origin, but fatal in its conclusion. The silence in their home is a permanent fixture now. The parents navigate their remaining years carrying the weight of two lost lives. One buried in the earth, the other buried in the prison system. The legacy of that fatal afternoon is a stark reminder of the fragility of the domestic peace and the terrifying speed with which adolescent frustration, fueled by digital dependency and access to lethal means, can shatter a family forever. The warning stands clear. The devices that connect us to the world can, if unchecked, disconnect us from our humanity, leaving behind nothing but broken hearts and quiet rooms. The conclusion of proceedings in Bibb County Superior Court brought an end to the legal chapter of Kevion Davis's life, but it marked only the beginning of an interminable sentence of grief for his parents. The facts of the case remain jarring in their triviality. A dispute over a Wi-Fi password, a common domestic friction in the digital age, escalated within seconds into lethal violence. When 14-year-old Kevion raised a firearm and pulled the trigger, killing his 18-year-old sister Tajavius Davis, he did not just commit a felony. He detonated the foundational structure of his family. The clinical irreversibility of death stands in stark contrast to the temporary anger that caused it. Tajavius is gone, her future erased by a singular impulse, leaving behind only police reports and autopsy diagrams to explain the physical mechanics of her death. However, the true weight of this tragedy rests on the shoulders of the mother, Latoya Bell. Her courtroom reaction transcended typical sorrow, revealing the impossible psychological position of loving both the murderer and the murdered. She stood before the judge not seeking vengeance, but navigating a labyrinth of loss, where justice for her daughter meant the incarceration of her son. The plea deal for voluntary manslaughter provides a judicial resolution, yet it offers no emotional salvage. Ultimately, the story ends where it began, in the quiet of a Macon home that is now defined by subtraction. The router lights still blink, and the bandwidth is clear, but the house is suffocated by a heavy silence. The parents are left to age with the knowledge that a trivial denial of internet access cost them everything. The final image is one of enduring isolation, where two parents sit in a living room that will never again hold their whole family, haunted by the ghost of a daughter and the memory of the son who took her away.